It's time to bring a spot of small form factor elegance to our reviewed cases this week. Hailing from Kölink is the Rocket, a mini ITX PC chassis that might be just the antidote for today's world of heavyweight systems infested with RGB. Hi, this is Tim from Vortex once again, substituting for David, and here is our review of the Kölink Rocket PC case. Designed to accommodate mini ITX motherboards and with highly restrictive component limitations, it tries to trade internal space for sleek looks and exterior that complements a sophisticated aesthetic. First, some background. As we noted in our written review, the Kölink Rocket is in many respects reminiscent of the Dan Case's A4 SFX. Both share a similar internal layout, complete with inverted motherboard and GPU mounting behind the motherboard tray. The exterior looks don't quite match the A4 SFX, but they're pretty damn close. Comparisons are therefore not without justification, even if one is significantly less expensive than the other. Oh, and the Rocket isn't the more expensive of the two. Kölink's Rocket needs to make an impact on its own merits, and a major impact at that. The case is priced at £159 including VAT in the UK, or €159 on the continent. Even if it were a chassis constructed entirely of aluminium, that would be a premium price for the form factor. The Rocket is a pretty diminutive case for a desktop system, especially one that can accept a full-size graphics card. At 328mm long, it's hardly the shortest case in the world, but a width of 125mm makes it exceptionally narrow. Furthermore, it's only 235mm tall. To put that into context, we recently reviewed the Cooler Master Q300L, a small form factor case for micro ATX systems that was 150mm taller and almost twice as wide. The Rocket is clearly a case to put on your desk or under a TV, presuming your TV standard shelves spaced that far apart. Hiding it away in a cupboard, however, would be a waste of its attractive aesthetics and a £150 price tag. So, is the Kölink Rocket the sort of case you want in your office? Let's take you through its features. The front and top of the Kölink Rocket are formed from a single piece of shaped aluminium, giving it that sleek, seamless look. A black anodized brushed aluminium finish is like catnip for some hardware enthusiasts. The front features two USB 3.0 ports, connected via a motherboard header, and a single power button. Not provided are any audio outputs, or more up-to-date USB, such as a Type-C connector. You'll also note that there's no air intakes on the front, nor exhaust at the top. More on that in a bit. Moving to the back, you can see that the brushed aluminium finish extends all the way around. That's a nice touch that would have been overlooked on a less well-appointed chassis. The motherboard I/O and PCI slots are oriented in parallel, giving you some inkling of the case's internal layout. Despite the slim dimensions, a dual-slot graphics card is supported. Clearly, however, said graphics card will not be plugged directly into the motherboard. Also, don't be fooled by the 3-pin connector at the top for mains power. An internal extension lead connects an unorthodox front-mounted PSU. Now for a quick glimpse underneath. Have you spotted what's missing? Yes, there are no integrated feet. Kölink provides sticky rubber pads that serve as feet. That's a very unsatisfying solution when great pains have been made to follow through with a brushed aluminium design. A set of aluminium feet, perhaps doubling as screws, would have been a nice alternative. The two side panels are identical pieces of shaped aluminium which have been perforated to provide substantial ventilation in lieu of front or floor intakes. While this should be plenty for most systems, we should note that air filtering is not provided in this design. Hopefully you keep your rooms well vacuumed. Panels are affixed to the chassis with 4 recessed screws. You'll want to be extremely careful when installing and removing the panels. One slip and you can easily scratch and permanently mar that brushed finish. Here's how things come together when a system is installed into the case. As you can see, it accommodates a mini ITX motherboard, inverted rather than in an orthodox orientation. Internally, the Rocket makes use of a partition design. In one chamber sits the motherboard. Behind it in the other sits the graphics card. The motherboard tray acts as a separator between the two chambers. Cramped internals and undirected airflow means that you have to be meticulous with cable management. Not obstructing intakes for the CPU, GPU and power supply should take priority, while also keeping it as tidy as possible for your own vanity's sake. Give yourself plenty of time to install systems into the Rocket, because a lack of space makes things tricky, and a mistake could be very tedious to fix afterwards. The Rocket is compatible with SFX and SFXL PSUs, of which there are an increasing number on the market today. While this in theory limits the power available to components, in practice a single CPU and GPU should stay well within the practical limit of 600 watts supplied by a high-performance SFXL design. The power supply is installed via a bracket rather than directly into the chassis. And this is the tricky part. You need to make sure that the PSU extension cable is installed before placing the bracketed PSU in the case, and that the PSU is switched on. There's effectively no direct access to the rear of the PSU when the case is properly installed. Attached to the top of the frame and between motherboard and GPU sits the case's single 80mm exhaust fan. Air is exhausted in the gap between top panel and side panels, which is clearly something of a compromise element to the design. Realistically, the limited exhaust airflow has the potential to cause heat build-up inside the case when power-hungry high-performance hardware is used. To say the least, a heavily overclocked system would be an unwise choice. From the other side of the case, we can see the section intended for a discrete graphics card. Narrow chassis dimensions necessitate the card sits upright, but a more conventional layout would place it directly over the motherboard. This layout separates them both, to the extent that CPU and GPU draw cool air from opposite sides of the case. In this orientation, graphics card fans will draw air directly through the side panel, but will also mean there's little to muffle the sound generated by the card. A quiet GPU cooler will therefore be very important if you want to have this case sat alongside you on a desk. GPU and motherboard are connected via a flexible PCI Express riser cable, which runs behind the motherboard and through a gap in the motherboard tray. We found that removing the riser cable before system installation and then gently feeding it behind the motherboard was the best approach. The cable is durable enough, but you need to take care not to put too much pressure on the motherboard's PCI Express slot when installing. You will also want to keep it clear of the exhaust fan blades to prevent any wear. As you might expect, space for storage in the Rocket is very limited. Kolink have squeezed in as much as they can through a tray that sits within the cavity in the floor of the chassis, and the tray can accommodate up to two 2.5-inch drives. These drives are screwed in through the sides, but the tray doesn't support larger 3.5-inch mechanical drives. Perhaps the most pressing issue with the Rocket is the matter of CPU clearance. Official specifications limit the CPU cooler assembly height at 54mm, far less than your typical desktop or even small form factor restrictions. We have opted to install the Noctua NH-L9i in this system, a cooler which is only 50mm tall. It's also an active top-down cooler, and so will draw air in through the side panel perforations and provide some additional cooling to surface-mounted motherboard components around the CPU socket. In contrast to the CPU cooler, graphics card restrictions are relatively loose. Lengthwise, it can accept a card up to 310mm long, while thickness is limited to 40mm. Our Aorus RX 570, for instance, had plenty of space. Most modern cards should therefore be compatible, but thicker 2.5 slot cards, such as the Aorus GTX 1080 Ti Extreme Edition, won't be suitable. One other point to mention is you'll want to take care hooking up the PCI Express power connectors. The weight of the card isn't supported by the motherboard, and so you'll need to provide pressure on both sides to plug it in securely. With that in mind, plugging in the PCI Express power and then the riser cable would be sensible. And that's the Kolink Rocket case. It's certainly attractive enough to tempt money from your wallet, but does it have the chops to work well as an enclosure for a PC in day-to-day use? Well, we're torn on that score. On build quality, it certainly scores highly. The brushed aluminium finish is excellent, and there can be no concerns about durability and rigidity in the steel frame. We would have no issues with showing it off in an office space that needed to be smart and refined, avoiding the garish gamer aesthetic. Internally, the features are sensible rather than revolutionary. Clearly, the layout takes its cues from the designs released prior to this, but the Rocket nonetheless implements it well. Cabling is a little frustrating, but that's always the case with such small systems, though we should note that the intended routing of the PCI Express riser cable could be explained a little better. Other restrictions will practically limit the sort of system that can be installed in the Rocket, more so than some other small form factor chassis. Beyond a mini ITX motherboard, you're restricted to a 54mm tall cooler, which will in turn limit your overclock. With an SFXL PSU, you'll be looking at a realistic top end of 600 watts, and we can quite imagine that owners will trip up over some GPU SKUs which occupy a little more space than two PCI Express slots. But all that comes with the territory. Where the Rocket starts to look weak is the cooling. Only a single 80mm exhaust fan supplies any sort of airflow, and itself exhausts through a narrow gap. Internal components rely on air flowing through the perforated side panels drawn in by both graphics card and CPU cooler, which is less than ideal. Ensuring that their panels remain unobstructed will be very important long term. Oh, and forget water cooling unless you're an extremely adept modder. Even standard 120mm radiators are not supported by the chassis in any orientation. Component choice will also be an important factor in another way, reducing noise. There's little in the way of dampening to prevent you from hearing the whir of internal fans or other issues, so GPUs that have a near silent mode will be almost mandatory. But more than that, the Rocket just cuts a few corners in ways that surprised us. Stick-on feet are perhaps the primary example, but a lack of air filtering is another. Hopefully the case will exist in a dust-free environment, otherwise both GPU and CPU cooler could get gummed up in short order. More minor oversights, such as limited front panel connectivity, will only concern us if we really needed that front panel USB 3.1 Type-C, for example. So, at £159 including VAT, the Kolink Rocket comes in far below the £200 plus price point of its chief rival, the Dan Case's A4 SFX. It's not a difficult case to build in, with serviceable cable management despite cramped interior. Planning is required, and you should take your time installing to not accidentally damage interior or exterior, but that's not exactly rocket science. However, for us to recommend it, you would really need to fall in love with the looks beyond all other aspects. And that's the Kolink Rocket, which achieved our approved award for aesthetics and build quality. If you've fallen in love with it for your next system, you can buy it in the UK now for £159.99 from Overclockers UK. Let us know what you thought of the case below, along with any other comments or questions. And of course, check out the written review. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.